Hey there, I've got the motor out of the Chevette. It's in need of some attention, so I'm going to tear it down. I'll take you guys along kind of step by step and show you what I had to do to make a Chevette motor competitive in an average mini stock class. So let's check it out.
First thing I'm going to do is put the motor at top dead center. I use my thumb in the #1 spark plug hole to feel when the air is coming out from the compression stroke. Then I just use the timing marks on the crankshaft and the crank pulley to get myself to top dead center. I'll make a mark on the cam gear and the cam gear cover, and this way if I don't have to make any modifications to the camshaft itself, when I put the motor back together, the cam will be in the same spot as it was when it came off the motor, and it's just a little easier to time. I like to leave the fuel pump in, the mechanical fuel pump. I generally run an electric pump, but I've run into a situation where my electric pump's failed and I've had to replumb and use the mechanical pump as a backup. The reason I keep it in is because there's a rod, and this is the push rod for the pump. It's powered, or it's activated by a cam on the distributor, and that is also an oil pressure passage. So without that rod in there, the engine doesn't build oil pressure. So instead of building a block off plate and using the rod, I'd rather have that mechanical pump in there as a backup just in case. One of the biggest downfalls to these engines, or in the application that we use them for, racing, is these valve cover gaskets. Generally, I'd seal them up with a little bit of RTV. It's just the cork gasket, and I'll take them on and off quite often to adjust the valves, and they just never seal back up, and it leaks oil, mists it all over the engine, and it just kind of makes it dirtier than I'd like it to be, but it's kind of what I get to deal with. Not much of a choice. I always find it safer to break all the bolts loose manually, and then I'll use the power tools to rip them out pretty quick after they've been loosened. The rest of the disassembly is pretty standard, as it would be for any other 40-year-old engine.
This is our first look at the bottom end. This is the first look I've had at it since it's been built. Lots of carbon buildup on the pistons. I've just been running my crankcase vent right back into the air filter, right back in, so it's going to create a lot of carbon. I think I'm going to do that a little bit differently when I put it back together. But the top of the pistons show, at this point, no point of stress, no real damage, which I was really hoping for, because these are the most expensive part of the engine. So I had to modify the oil pickup to suit the new pan when I built the new oil pan, and all it really consisted of is we moved the pickup back about 2 inches from its original mounting point, and then just had to make an extension tube, and then I ended up shortening the pickup as well to fit inside the pan because we shrunk the pan. The original setup I had, this was actually just a piece of hose. It lasted like 3.5 seasons before it sucked itself shut. Took me a while to figure that one out, and that's why stupid costs extra.
I spent a fair amount of time measuring clearances and writing them down to compare them to the original build sheet and just to get an idea where things are at this point. And from the best of my experience and limited knowledge, everything looks really good. I filled the intake and exhaust runners in the cylinder head with solvent to see if any would weep out past the valves. It looks like we got a little bit of lapping to do on the valves, but no major work should be needed here either. A lot of pictures and text messages were sent to friends during the cleaning and inspection of the bearings, just to get a second opinion on the stuff that I'm not that familiar with.
So I've got the engine apart, every piece is out, I've cleaned them all up, I've taken a good look at them, and we were right to shut it down when we did. Found a little bit of weird marking on a bearing on the number 1 cylinder, and then the number 3 cylinder showing some signs of heat. It's got some discolorization, no abnormal bearing wear and no scarring, so I think it's okay, but it did get hot, and that's the typical problem point with these engines, is the number 3 cylinder and the lack of oil that it gets. That's why we don't cheap out on oil, because even though there was an oiling problem here and it did get hot, it didn't let the bearing go and it didn't create any scarring, it didn't cause any significant damage, so we got pretty fortunate. Otherwise, I got a couple things to show to some friends and get some expert opinions, and we can decide what we're doing when we're putting it back together. Why don't I go through this engine kind of piece by piece with you guys? I'll show you what I did to make it happen. So the first thing, and probably the sexiest, is the pistons and rods. These are just off the shelf Eagle pistons for a Honda B16.
It's an actual connecting rod
Series engine. The bearing journal on the crank was ground down. It only takes a tiny bit to make these rods fit on the stock crank. And then the pistons, they're just flat top pistons, custom pistons, ordered by the engine builder. That was the most expensive part of the whole build, was getting these figured out. But floating wrist pins, you know, nothing groundbreaking. They ride at a 0 deck height. So the crankshaft is pretty much untouched, right? It's been balanced, like I said, the rod journal is ground down to fit the bearings for the Honda rods. But other than that, we're not allowed to do anything. There's a lot of work that a guy could do on here if he wanted to try and squeak some more out of the engine, but we're not allowed, so that's what we get. So the cylinder head's pretty basic. It's been pretty heavily ported, but it retains the stock valves, untouched combustion chambers. Nothing's been messed with there. And then we're just running bullet valve springs, little higher spring tension. That is the only option we have for these engines, is these bullet valve springs. I should mention, this is the last 3 numbers in this head. It's a 343 head, as known in the Chevette world. It's kind of an in-between the first generation, the 1.6 liters, and then the later generations where they went to the real smog heavy engines. They've just got a way better intake port design. I prefer these ones over the early generations that a lot of guys figured work better. I think this is a better head personally.
I have a feeling at the end of the day, depending on how much work you're willing to put into either head, it's probably a saw-off. But this head matched up with the 2-barrel intake, I prefer is way more effective over top of this head with a single barrel intake that's been modified to accept a 2-barrel carb. I don't see that working nearly as well as one of these when it's done properly. It's just a bullet cam, kind of off the shelf. I ended up buying it off of somebody else, which was nice. The adjustable cam pulley, these were used to be made by a guy in Ohio. They're really nice. If you can find them now, buy them. If you can't, you can have an adapter made and you can run a Mustang 2.3 liter square tooth pulley. The diameter and the tooth count is identical. I had one on the first engine I built, and I kind of wish I never got rid of it. I did some trading once I got my hands on one of these. You can get the Mustang pulleys come a lot lighter, and if something were to ever happen, you can always replace it. So what I've got going on here is I've opened up a lifter body, kind of cut the top off, and then this is just a lock nut welded in there. That's a 1/4 inch bolt with a dome head that actually fits right inside the rocker arm. And what I ended up doing was drilling out the center of that hole in the rocker arm, and that allows me to put I believe it's a 3/16 socket in there and adjust that to adjust my lifter, my valve lash. It wasn't my idea. It was another Chevette guy came up with the idea. I just got to put it in motion, and it works really, really well. A long time ago, they used to really struggle. Guys would make custom lifters, and it was 2 wrenches and trying to get it inside. The cam carrier was not easy. This is easy. It's a great little trick. So the oil pan I made or modified, it's basically, this is a small block claimer kit, a Speedway claimer oil pan kit. Small block claimer kit, a Speedway claimer oil pan kit. You can buy to modify a small block Chevy oil pan. It's basically got the left side sump on it. There's 2 swing gates. The oil returns in here, and then there's 2 swing gates to keep it in the oil pickup and to slosh it around a little bit less. There's no aftermarket options for oil pans for Chevettes, so we build them. So the distributor, same thing, stock distributor. It's got this little module bypass for the MSD box. And then the only thing I've done to it is I've locked out the mechanical advance. So it just stays locked in at whatever you set the timing in. The vacuum advance is gone, mechanical advance is gone. We do that because under circle track conditions, we're wide open throttle 90% of the time, and we don't need to worry about the advance. So I set this thing at 36 degrees, and that runs 36 degrees all the time. Generally with my engine, it's around a 10-to-1 static compression. And with the fuel mixture that I was running, it was probably a true 96 or 97 octane. Kept a really nice burn, clean, fairly cool. Works well. Otherwise, there's no modifications done to the distributor. So a lot of work went into the intake manifold. We started by cutting the back right off. We cut the back off, and we used that to be able to port the runners all the way through. So the runners have been ported all the way through, and then they're gasket matched and matched to the head. That was a substantial amount of work. What I had also done, if you look at a picture of a stock Chevette manifold, there was a water jacket under here. This was all solid. That's where the coolant runs to keep your air temperatures up for better burn and all that bogus emissions stuff that race cars don't like. So that was all cut out of here. And now the only spot the water gets into is it comes in from the radiator through here and then right into the engine. So there's no water anywhere in here. The EGR has been blocked off and deleted, and it's just in need of some cleanup. What I also did in the factory orientation, the carburetor sits this way. I rotated the carburetor 90 degrees and was able to widen out that plenum. Just makes the carburetor in a better position, and you get a better spread, more direct into the runners, as opposed to having it here and then having to really swirl around in there. So I do have some epoxy inside that I use to kind of smooth out some of the rough edges, right? And then that vacuum gauge is just there for reference, so when you're running the engine you can see what it's doing. Anybody that knows me kind of knows my stance on carburetors. This is a Weber 3838, nothing done to it. I actually got this in a trade. I traded it to a guy. He had an old E12 BMW 2002, and it was too much carburetor for his car. He traded it to me, and I literally bolted it on to my race car as it was on his, and it's been working perfect ever since. I tried to go the Holley route. They're just not made for 4-cylinder engines. Around here, a lot of people struggle with them, and I don't know why they continue to struggle with them and try them. For what our mini stock engines are making for power, one of these will work perfectly fine. They will give you all the power you need. They will give you more reliability than a Holley, in my opinion. And they're made for a 4-cylinder engine. They can take the vibration. They can take everything that the Holley has troubles with on a 4-cylinder engine. So there's a few guys that seem to be able to figure it out. I preferred the bolted on and go route. This bolts on to the factory flange for the Chevette, which makes a big difference too. You don't have to come up with some kind of goofy adapter. It's just a better quality carb, and you can get Chinese knockoffs for super cheap. And then that brings us to the block. It's just a standard Chevette block. Only thing done to this, piston bore, or the cylinders were bored over about 100 thou for the pistons. That's generally the max you can do. Some guys, when they get their blocks tested on the Chevette, I've heard of them going up as high as 120 over. This one's about 100 over, and that's it. Couple of things I'm going to do before I rebuild it is I'm going to really polish the crankcase and try and smooth that up, and you just get a little bit less oil restriction when that's all nice and smooth. And maybe I'll put a windage tray in it. And then from the top, same thing, no nothing special to report. So that about wraps it up. Motor's apart. I got a rough idea of what needs to be done. I'm just gonna get a couple friends to take a look at things, give me a little bit more advice as to the detail I need to go. But we made the right decision shutting it down for one more race, as opposed to doing what I wanted to do and taking it out. Otherwise, I feel like that number 3 piston would have ate the motor, and I wouldn't be making this video, and I'd probably be parking the Chevette in the backyard for the next however many years it would take to save up to build a new engine. So that's a good thing. Anyways, this is all going to get kind of shoved off to the side until I can gather up the parts and the money to put it back together. Now I've got the family Jetta, which needs some major attention. It's going to be a fairly substantial bill to fix that car now, and just the other cost of life. So this is going to kind of take a back burner. Should be back together by the spring, because that's all we got to do. The car is just sitting on jack stands, waiting for the engine to be put back in. So that's a pretty good situation to be in. Who knows what's happening with the Beamer at this point. It's covered up, it's tarped up. I've got some other stuff I'm going to be bringing in here once all the priorities are taken care of. So thanks for watching. Keep in touch. We'll catch you guys later on. Cheers.